Welcome to another Hot Topic School Talk. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, I am Rob Vischer. I have the pleasure of serving as the 16th president of St. Thomas, and I'm here to moderate and also just to affirm how important these events are. Just yesterday, I was meeting with one of our elected officials who was encouraging us at St. Thomas to try to push back against the polarization and the vitriol, and can we do things to help our students understand the importance of civil dialogue? And I was able to say, well, actually, at the law school, we've been doing that for many years through the Murphy Institute. This is exactly the kind of debate and dialogue we need more of, where we're showing the difference between disagreement occurring within relationship versus agreement being a precondition for relationship. And so it's every bit as important as what is said here substantively. What's important is the format, the context, food, fellowship, friendship, and important disagreement. So on the topic of gun ownership for self-defense, we all bring our different lenses to this. So much of it, not all of it, but much of it can be cultural. I remember my wife and I moved here from New York City, where we lived in Queens, New York, before coming to Minnesota. And one day in Queens, our 3-year-old daughter was invited over for a play date at a home where we learned they had a gun in the home. And my wife and I had a real serious discussion. Would we allow our daughter to go have a play date at a place where there was a gun in the home? Like, I didn't grow up around guns. I didn't grow up with friends who hunted. It was totally new to me. And we didn't know folks in our friend circle in New York City. They didn't have guns. And so we went back and forth. I don't know, I guess we just need to be careful. So then, fast forward, we moved to Minneapolis, and we live in Southwest Minneapolis. We live a few blocks south of Lake Harriet. It's a very politically left-leaning neighborhood. Just about everybody has a gun in the house, because wherever you are in the political spectrum, if you're in Minnesota, there's a good chance that you or a family member hunt in some way. And so then if we were going to have that same standard, I don't know if we'll let our kids play at a house. They were going to be pretty lonely kids. So it's very cultural what we're talking about, but it doesn't mean that there's not substance to get to. And that's what we want to do today, is get to the substance. So the format, each participant will have up to 15 minutes to present their side, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And I believe the participants are familiar to most of you, both esteemed members of our faculty, Professor Julie Jonas and Professor Greg Sisk. And I don't even know which sides they're taking, though I could hazard a guess. And I believe we're going to start with Professor Sisk, so please welcome our debate participants.
Good afternoon. So let me begin by setting some parameters for what our conversation is going to be about this afternoon. We're here to talk about the practicality, the wisdom, the morality of owning a firearm for self-defense. We are not talking today about other gun-related issues, such as whether certain types of firearms should be banned or the size of magazines should be limited, etc. These, of course, are issues that are being debated today, but they are not the topic of today's conversation. So here's my basic proposition. Let's take the most common firearm in America today, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. It's a firearm that is legal in every state, and there is no prospect that it is going to be banned in our lifetime. So here's how I will present today's question. If I were to purchase a 9mm pistol for self-defense, is that a wise and moral choice for me? Now, I want to start with the very good reasons why you might choose not to own a gun. And I do this because if you make the choices I have to own a gun, I want it to be based on a responsible decision that involves significant commitments on your part before you do so. So first you need to have some self-awareness and talk with others who know you. If there is a significant possibility that someone in your home will have a mental health crisis, then you should not have a gun in that home. And because we can't always predict the future, as Yogi Berra said, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. We need to think about other options. So my firearms are locked, and my wife knows where the key is. And if I were in a position of crisis, she would be in a position to take that gun away and deny me access to those firearms. Second, and also part of that self-awareness, you need to ask, will you be comfortable with the gun? Will you be accepting of the possibility that you might injure or kill another person in defense of yourself or your family? Now, St. John Paul the Great, in his encyclical on the culture of life, said this: "Unfortunately, it happens that the need to render the aggressor incapable of causing harm sometimes involves taking his life. In this case, the fatal outcome is attributable to the aggressor who brought the action about." And St. Thomas Aquinas, the namesake of our university, wrote, "Nor is it necessary for salvation that a man omit the act of moderate self-defense to avoid killing the other man." Nevertheless, the prospect of taking another human life should be sobering. Catholic Catechism on Self-Defense says it is a fundamental moral principle to insist on your own right to life. At the same time, there are threads in the Catholic tradition that recognize those who heroically make sacrifices not to ever take up arms. And that's a morally legitimate choice as well. Third, do you have the right temperament to be a gun owner? So one of my firearms instructors put it, you can carry your ego or you can carry your gun. You cannot carry both. So that means if you're going to carry a gun, you must be an exceptionally polite and indeed submissive person. Remember to turn the other cheek. An insult never justifies resort to lethal force. You must never, ever be in a position when you are carrying a gun to escalate a dispute. Fourth, are you planning to use marijuana recreationally or drink alcohol? Despite the state's approval of marijuana for recreational use, it remains a federal felony to use marijuana or any illegal controlled substance and own a gun. Let me be clear about that. It is not just a ban on having a gun with you while you are using. It is a felony to own a gun and use marijuana recreationally. Now, that's being challenged, and at least one court of appeals has held that that's unconstitutional, but that remains the law at the moment. And if you drink alcohol, keep in mind, the alcohol limit for someone who is carrying a gun is half that of what is allowed for drinking and driving. So you may want to be a teetotaler if you are carrying a gun. Fifth, have you thought about where to store the firearm? Every gun owner should have a place to make the gun secure in their own home. Now, this is especially true if you have children in the home. But it's something you should think about in other ways, too, because burglary is always a possibility. And fortunately, quick access safes are reliable and effective and very inexpensive. Sixth, have you thought about what you will do if you are carrying and you come to a place where you cannot or should not carry? For example, the University of St. Thomas has a no weapons policy. Now, President Vischer, I understand you're exempt from that policy, isn't that right?
Or deny.
Well, so I have a picture here of President Vischer in the middle of the St. Paul campus, and I believe the object that he's holding in his hand is referred to as a mace, which the dictionary defines as a club-like armor-breaking weapon of war. The dictionary also says, of course, that it is a ceremonial staff carried as a symbol of office, and that's, of course, what President Vischer was doing with that mace. There can be some debates about what counts as a weapon under a no-weapons policy, but there can be no debate that a firearm is a weapon. So that means that I never have and I never will carry my gun into the law school at the University of St. Thomas. I respect property rights as well, and I think the property owner should be able to dictate the terms on which access to that property is given. So I have to think about, what am I going then to do? Should I just leave my gun lying in the car where any car prowler could obtain it? And so what I instead have done is establish a safe in my car so that the gun is securely locked away when I come to a place that I cannot carry. You need to be thinking about these things if you're thinking about having a gun as well. Seventh, are you willing to make the commitment of time and energy to become a master of that firearm? If you're thinking about buying a gun just to put it in your dresser drawer and have it there for an emergency, please don't buy a gun. If you are going to buy a gun, you have to be willing to take the time and energy to learn how your gun works, how to maintain it, how to disassemble it, how to clean it, its safety features, etc. You don't need to develop the expertise of a gunsmith, but you really should learn to know that gun very well. And like any skill, you need to practice regularly, which means going to the range and shooting the gun. Don't buy a gun unless you are willing to spend many hours a year going to the range and actually using the gun. I'd like to get to the range twice a week. I've committed to being there once a week. And that way I understand the feel, the limits of the gun, how it works, and it's something with which I'm very comfortable. And as part of this, everyone who owns a gun should know the 4 rules and repeat them regularly. First, assume the gun is loaded. Second, even after you have cleared the gun, never point it at another person or anything that you can't afford to destroy. Third, never put your finger inside the trigger guard until you are ready to shoot. And fourth, ascertain not only your target, but what is behind the target. And since most of us are not perfect shots, I would add what's on either side of the target. So we can talk about this in question and answer, but I was having a discussion with someone and we were debating how many of these 4 rules did Alec Baldwin violate on the set of the Rust movie? And my answer is at least 3 of them. And if he had followed any of those 3, the tragedy would not have happened. So I've given you all the reasons why you might quite rightly decide not to buy a gun. And some of you are probably wondering, when are you going to hear the pro-gun argument being made? So why, despite all these reasons to say no, have I said yes? For much the same reason that when I get into my car, I put on the seatbelt and I appreciate that I have airbags. I don't expect that I'm going to have a life-threatening experience every time that I get into my car. But I know that that's a genuine possibility over the course of time. So I like to think that I'm a generally optimistic person. I think the students here would say I'm generally a pretty happy person at least when I'm in class, where I make a pretty good show of being happy and optimistic. But I have to admit that optimism is tested in Minneapolis. If you had asked me 4 years ago whether I knew anyone who in the previous 2 or 3 years had been the victim of a violent crime in Minneapolis, I happily would have said no. If you ask me that question today, I would have to say I know 5 people who have been the victims of violent crime in Minneapolis in the last 2 or 3 years. So we hear in the national news regularly about crime and controversies in cities like Chicago and New York. But what is not as widely known is what the FBI's statistics tell us about Minneapolis, something I suspect is not very often reported in the Star Tribune. On a per capita basis, the violent crime rate in Minneapolis has grown to 30% higher than Chicago. And the per capita violent crime rate in Minneapolis is twice as high as in New York City. The sad reality is that Minneapolis has moved into one of the dozen or so most dangerous cities in America. Now, the media tends not to report on violent crime in Minneapolis unless someone is killed. But the sad reality is that armed robberies, carjackings, and shootings are a several times a day reality of life in Minneapolis today. And then there is the unavailability of the police. In 2019, Minneapolis had one of the lowest per capita police forces in the country. Newark, New Jersey is often touted as an example of success in community-based policing. It has twice the number of police officers per capita as Minneapolis did 4 years ago. New York City also has twice as many police officers per capita as Minneapolis. And of course, that Minneapolis number has been dropping with about a third to half as many police today. And so the reality is that we are our own first responders. I never want to be in a situation where I'm being threatened or my house is being broken into. And the only thing I can do is call 911, knowing that the response is not going to come before the incident is over. And the Catholic Catechism says that legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a duty for one who is responsible for the lives of others. And then finally, and more positively, and this brings me back to the cultural differences that President Vischer spoke about. I grew up with guns, like a large percentage of people in Minnesota, especially outside of the Twin Cities, but apparently from Professor Vischer's report, even inside the Twin Cities. And I do enjoy target shooting and strengthening my skills. In fact, my distance eyesight has improved dramatically since I started spending more time away from computers and books and looking downrange. For the first time in my adult life this past year, I qualified for my driver's license without corrective lenses. And so there's an argument you probably didn't expect, but one that I'm going to close with. Take up target shooting and improve your eyesight. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Julie Jonas.
Thank you. My eyesight has not improved. Thank you, Professor Sisk. Thank you so much, President Vischer, for being here, coming all the way to Minneapolis to moderate this important event, and to all of you for coming to listen to us today. I think that one thing that's important to think about is how Professor Sisk started. It is a wise and moral choice for him, but we also need to think about the greater good. As of October of this year, so 10 months into the year, there had been 565 mass shootings in the United States. That's defined as 4 or more people being shot in a single incident. Since 2015, the number of mass shooting incidents and the number of people killed or injured in them has continued to increase. Also, in the first 10 months of this year, more than 35,000 people have been killed by gun violence. Now, I know that's not what we're here to talk about today. I know we're here to talk about gun use for self-defense. But I can't talk about this without mentioning the fact that we have a serious problem with gun violence in this country. And a lot of that comes from the availability of guns. To be sure, if I thought that people could truly defend themselves with guns by personal gun ownership, that would be a laudable goal. But I just don't think that's the case. I think a lot of my views, and we've talked about this culturally, are molded by my upbringing. I was raised in Minnesota, but without any guns around. I lived in suburban Minnesota. My family didn't have guns. They didn't hunt. They didn't target shoot. None of my close friends or close family members had guns or target shot. Their families didn't. So I just wasn't around guns. I didn't see my first gun until I was not that a policeman or a soldier wasn't carrying until I was 25 years old. So I was shocked to learn that 1 in 3 of us own guns. I was so surprised by that because it's just not really a part of my upbringing. I did want to know more about what it's all about, especially since before I came here, I made my living defending people who shot other people with guns. So I wanted to learn more about guns, how they operated, all of those kinds of things. I was able to take the opportunity to go to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. They had a firearms training that they offered, so I could handle and shoot several different firearms. I was hoping I would understand the attraction a little bit. I didn't. It just seemed loud and smelly and noisy, but that's okay. That's okay. I do think it is absolutely fine for Professor Sisk to own a gun for self-defense. I believe you have the temperament for it. I believe you observe great safety protocols with your guns. He lives in a home without children, I believe without any serious mental illness, and without a partner who might be prone to domestic violence. I also assume his home and his car have sufficient security so that no one could break in and steal those guns. He's also a white man, which gives him some advantage and some privilege around gun ownership. I want to talk about each of these things using some statistics. I know hearing numbers isn't always that fun, but unfortunately in this case the numbers are in my favor. So, thinking of children, firearms are the leading cause of death of children and teens ages 1 through 19 in the United States. not car accidents, not diseases, not illnesses, but firearms. Every year, about 19,000 children and teens are shot and killed or wounded in the United States. For children and teens killed by gunfire, the rate of gun deaths went up between 2019 and 2021. Even accounting for the population increase, that rate went up 46%. Homicide is the largest single category of gun deaths amongst children and teens, accounting for 60%. Suicide is number 2 at 32%, and gun accidents at 5%. What I'd like to ask you is, where are these children getting these guns, right? They can't buy them legally. So somehow they're getting them from adults. Either they're stealing them, the adults are not keeping them secure, and they're handled accidentally, or some adults are even allowing their children to have guns in a purposeful manner. Suicide accounts for the largest number of gun deaths, and I think it's really important that professors talked about this and the prevalence of mental illness. In 2021, there was over 26,000 gun suicides in the United States. That's about 54% of all gun deaths. The use of a gun was also the greatest cause of suicides, which accounted for 55% of suicides. Imagine the fact that you could kill yourself just using one finger, right? And that there would be no time for second thoughts or regrets. Thinking about domestic violence, in 2/3 of all cases of women being killed by their domestic partner, that partner used a gun. And Black women are twice as likely, I've got a different quote here, are twice as likely as white women to be fatally shot by their intimate partner. Consider gun theft. I'm sure your guns are very secure, but the FBI says a gun is stolen from a car every 15 minutes. It's a little hard to come at the exact numbers for gun thefts because most states don't require that you report a gun theft, and many people will underreport gun thefts or not report at all. But in the last decade, we know there were 2 million reported gun thefts. 2 million reported gun thefts, and that's probably an undercount. And then there's the issue of race. Black Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die of gun homicide. Black Americans are 3 times more likely than white Americans to be fatally shot by the police. I couldn't find any statistics on how often a Black person who legally owns a gun is shot by a police officer. But we know the names, right? We know the names. We know Breonna Taylor. We know Breonna Taylor's boyfriend legally owned the weapon he used when the police broke down their door, and he did not realize they were police officers, and Breonna Taylor was shot and killed. Amir Locke here in the Twin Cities. We know he legally owned his gun when he reached for it again when the police broke down the door to the apartment that he was sleeping in. And Philando Castile, also a Minnesota case, he was stopped at a traffic stop during the middle of the day and told the police officer he had a legal weapon. And the police officer shot him. The police are obviously concerned that the populace is armed, that so many people have guns that they believe are for self-defense. All the people we just talked about, they have guns they believe they were holding for self-defense. But this, I believe, is making our law enforcement very trigger happy and very concerned for their own safety. It's interesting to me that the support for the Second Amendment and gun ownership is so strong that it overrides the desires of law enforcement. And usually in this country, law enforcement are one of the strongest lobbying groups. Finally, I want to talk about how often guns are actually used for self-defense. There was a Harvard study of the National Crime Victim Survey between 2007 and 2011. Gun owners used guns to defend themselves in less than 1% of all crimes. 1% of all crimes. There are self-reported studies, to be sure, where gun owners report a higher rate of gun usage for self-defense. However, many scholars are concerned that those self-reported surveys, the numbers are inflated. I did find one more recent study that I thought had pretty good methodology. It was a review of media stories in the Gun Violence Archive. The Gun Violence Archive is a publicly available database of all national and local news reports, TV and print, of the use of firearms usage in the United States. This review took place over a 4-month period in 2019. Again, looking at the whole country, all reported gun violence. Now, of course, you are avoiding the self-reporting problem. The media may not have picked up all of the stories, but likely if someone used a gun in self-defense, it was more likely to make it into the media. The authors found only 418 uses of guns for self-defense. The vast majority of those involved drugs, gangs, or domestic violence. Only 20% were home invasions. And of those 450 cases of self-defense, 105 of the defenders themselves were injured or killed. So 25% of the time, the defender himself or herself is injured or killed. In closing, I think it's great for Professor Sisk to own a gun for self-defense, but given the numbers, I think he's the exception to the rule. And I think for the greater good, we should not have guns for self-defense. And we should limit gun ownership in our country. That's it.
Okay, time for questions. Just a very gentle request. If you have your own point to make, please at least make a good faith attempt to state it in the form of a question. Your voice usually goes up at the end of the sentence. If you don't sense your own voice going up when you're done, you probably have not asked a question. So questions. The floor is open.
Both brought a lot of really good points on each side, and so my question to each of you is there anything that the other person said that you would actually consider as to like this is a good reason why you would like consider changing your mind? Not that you would, but
I'll go first. And the reason I'm stepping up is the microphone's here so that we make sure to pick this up. If you mean something that would actually change my mind and cause me to surrender my gun altogether, the answer to that is no. Looking for common ground, though, I mean, that's part of what these discussions in the Hot Topics Cool Talk is about. Is not that we're going to come to a complete meeting of the minds, but we might see some places where we could come together on some common ground, like red flag laws. You know, the devil's in the details, what the due process points are for that, but I'm in favor of red flag laws. Understanding that suicide is an issue. And, you know, I spoke to that, and we need to speak to that as well. Some things I disagree with, for example, on defensive use of firearms. Part of the difference of opinion there is what you define as the use of a firearm. The actual discharge of a firearm in self-defense is unusual. The display of a firearm to end a criminal attack is much more common. The most recent study of that from Georgetown University involved a survey of 54,000 people. I believe it was 2021, might have been 2022, and estimated that defensive gun use in that way by display happens 1.7 million times a year, and so a much, much higher rate. I'm also very troubled by the increase in gun violence that was discussed. And the question becomes how to address that. You know, one possibility would be to ban firearms. I don't think that's going to happen, and I think the enforcement of that would be very difficult. We banned a very popular product in the 1930s called alcohol. That did not go well. I think this would go very badly too. So what other things can we look to? What are the cultural changes? You know, we talked about different communities that what our background is. I spent 2 years living in a town in Montana of 4,500 people. Everyone had a gun. The stereotype of the rifle in the rack in the car was not a stereotype. Every car had that. We all had guns. There were no armed robberies. There were no carjackings. The only incident that I remember in the 2 years I was there was a 15-year-old kid who accidentally shot himself with a .22 rifle when he was shooting at gophers. There were the occasional bar fights, but they were with fists, and there just wasn't any gun violence. And yet guns were more ubiquitous than they are here. Why? Why is it that that has changed so much and changed so much in recent years? So I think some of those cultural things we need to address as well. But let me.
I will say the one thing that Professor Sisk said that did kind of play for me is reduced police response time, right? That you may not be able to get law enforcement there quickly enough. But I live in the suburbs where there is just reduced gun violence. There is less violence than there is in Minneapolis. And to be honest, so do you. You don't live in Minneapolis. You live in the suburbs.
So spend a lot of time in Minneapolis.
You do. So the reduced police response time, the reduction in our law enforcement is a problem, and that did resonate with me. The only other thing that you didn't bring up that might change my mind is if it was truly the end of days, right? I read a lot of dystopian fiction, and I will say, if that sort of thing happened, if there was, some sort of nuclear thing or electricity went away, whatever it is, then I might reconsider my position. But,
But before we go on, some of my students have heard me talk about this too, that I am a 5% prepper. And here's what I mean by that. I'm really pretty optimistic that we're going to make it through without societal collapse. 95% chance. But there's a 5% chance it's not going to happen. And it's not just nuclear war. It's not just civil war in the United States. But one of the biggest problems that our politicians haven't faced is we do not have a perfectly secure electrical grid. And every couple hundred years, the sun gives off such a blast of energy. The last time that happened, in the middle of the 19th century, that energy ran along telegraph wires and started fires. It was so powerful. If that happened today, it would shut down the electrical grid. And a commission for Congress, bipartisan commission, said if that happened, they estimated that 2/3 of Americans would be dead within 12 months of civil strife and starvation and exposure. So I do have some food that I have set aside, freeze-dried food. I do have some things towards that end.
I know your address.
Yes, you do. And some guns and ammunition, too.
I think it's at some level we're all preppers to some degree. My prep is a guy named Nick. He married my cousin, and he lives out in the country in Michigan, and he hunts and skins and cures beef and does all these things. And if it all hits the fan, he's going to have about 150 city-dwelling Vischer clans showing up in his yard. Professor Schultz.
I have a question. I think it gets to sort of the tension between making a decision based on common good and sort of making a decision based on us. And I'm asking this for a friend. Okay, under your guidelines, Greg, what if you had a household and one spouse in that household met all of your criteria? The other spouse in the household was not willing to meet up, was not willing to go to the range, was not willing to be trained, didn't want to get. Under your scenario, you need both spouses to have access to it in order to block it if there's a mental health crisis. And this untrained person, if they have a mental health crisis, they have access to it. Who wins? Who wins in a situation like that? How do you balance sort of what's better for the common good in a situation with multiple people living in a household?
I think you're describing something that's very common in terms of households. My wife doesn't go to the range. She doesn't use the guns, hasn't taken the training. That's a decision she's made. She's not anti-gun, that she's opposed to me having it. But the way in which on a day-to-day basis we handle that is she doesn't handle the gun. So it's not a situation where she, when the gun is removed, when it's put away, when I take it to the range, I'm the one who is doing that and following the rules. She doesn't have to follow the rules because she's not coming into contact with it. Yes, it's true she could gain access to that. She doesn't have a key, but she knows where it is. It's on my keychain, right here in my pocket. So if there was a situation where she was in a mental health crisis, I would be aware of that, and I would make sure she never got access to that key. But yeah, those are things that one needs to take into account. If I really thought there was a high chance that she would have a mental health crisis, then even with all of the other precautions I've taken, I'd certainly rethink. One thing that one can do, particularly if you're a target shooter, is the range that I belong to. You can store your firearms at the range. You can rent a locker there, and so I'd be able to continue to go to the range and check it out there and not have it in the home.
That wouldn't help for self-defense, though.
It wouldn't
which is
help.
the whole
It wouldn't
point.
help for self-defense. It would just be target shooting. That's true. By the way, one other thing I'd say in terms of self-defense, talking about the race issue, one of the aspects of the race issue that should be brought in focus is one of the largest increases in those who are obtaining carry permits in order to learn how to legally defend themselves are African Americans. There is a huge increase in that. I'm not going to name names, but I know African Americans in Minneapolis who are very involved in the concerns about police violence, have been involved in demonstrations, have been involved in working for reform, who have told me, you betcha I have a permit, and you betcha I carry a gun with me in many of the places that I go into, and they regard it as essential for their self-defense as well. So, well,
Gloria.
So I did grow up in a house where guns were there, and I was taught from a very young age to be respectful about the guns, about safety around guns. It was taught in a way where it wasn't something interesting to us, right? Because it was there and it was an everyday thing. And it sounds like Professor Sisk may have, had a similar experience, and that you, President Vischer, and Professor Jonas were never around them, never exposed them, never given that opportunity to develop a comfort level or respect for them in a way that you would feel comfortable. So my question is this: could you conceptualize a moment, an opportunity within schools where there is a lot of nervousness around guns, where you could teach skills and be respectful, not arming children, of course, but just teaching it, right? And so for the people who don't have someone who knows how to operate them, knows how to message around them, that other people could understand it.
I think the opportunity to learn is always important, but I personally don't want to normalize it. I just don't. I understand what you're saying, and empirically, in a way, I can think like, yeah, the opportunity to learn, it would make us all safer, but I don't want to normalize gun usage that way.
You're right in terms of the kind of community I grew up in. We did a lot of things in those days differently than they do now. I tell my students, for example, no one wore bike helmets. I don't know that they existed. And now, of course, we worry about that. In my family, the guns were not locked away. I don't know of any of my neighbors or friends whose parents locked up guns either. And yet none of us would have ever thought of taking possession of a gun without our parents' permission. But we also had something along the lines you're taking. Everyone took hunter safety courses when they turned about 12. That was just universal. I went through it. We weren't, it was very clear we were not going to go hunting. And we learned all of the sorts of things that we're talking about. And this, I'm sure that there were children who didn't go through that, but they were the minority in the city in Wisconsin that I grew up in. We learned about gun safety. Did that make a difference in terms of greater gun safety in that community? I have to think that it did. And we certainly weren't, afraid of guns, but we did have that training. And I think, unfortunately, if you don't have that training, at the very least, we could certainly train people to follow the 4 rules. You don't need to have a gun in your hand in order to know that. And yet I'm surprised by how many who aren't familiar with guns don't know those 4 rules. So did Alec Baldwin violate the 4 rules? 1, did he check to make sure the gun was loaded? He did not. 2nd, did he point it at a person? Yes, he did. 3rd, despite the fact that he denies it, he pulled the trigger. That gun did not go off accidentally. If he had followed any one of those 3 rules, the incident wouldn't have happened. He would have known that the gun was loaded, he would not have pointed it at another person, and he wouldn't have pulled the trigger. So, at least in terms of your own safety, you will never have an accident. You will never have a safety accident at home if you follow those 4 rules. But boy, you got to do it religiously. You got to, never any exceptions. Even if I think that I unloaded the gun, when I take it out again, I'm going to clear it, make sure about that. You've got to follow those 4 rules.
So you brought up certain individuals who died, so Breonna Taylor and others who died, who either were gun owners or were with partners who were gun owners. It could be interpreted from your argument that they would not have died but for them being gun owners, as opposed to for police training. Would you agree with that or no?
If you didn't hear the question, their causality to someone like Breonna Taylor being partnered with the gun owner and causal connection with her death in the interaction with police. So it is the gun ownership the key causal factor here.
Well, it's if they hadn't had guns, they probably wouldn't have died, right? I mean, I think that is just what it is. Do I think that the police that there are training issues there? I do. Do I agree with the way the police entered either of those two homes? Do I agree with when Philando Castile says, I have a legal gun right here, and the officer just shoots him? Like, that's a real problem, right? That's a real problem with policing and police training. But I think part of it comes from the fact that our law enforcement is so skittish every time they enter a building or stop a car because a third of the population is armed. And they just never know when they're going to get shot at. So I think it's both. But I think the crux of the issue is gun ownership. We don't have this sort of problems in other countries that limit gun ownership.
I think that's true outside of the concealed carry permit scenario. I think the Philandro Castile situation, I mean, we know by seeing the footage of that and learning more about it, that was an officer who should not have been out on the streets and did not know what he was doing. But the police officers that I talk to are very comfortable with those who have gone through the training and background check to have a permit. They know this is somebody who has been checked out. They are not. They do not have a criminal background. They know what they're doing. They've gone through at least a minimal amount of training. And I think it was a good change that the Minnesota legislature said to where if they ask you if you have a gun, that you now have to say. Now, Philandro Castile had said that, but beforehand you didn't have to answer that question. Some states require that you actually volunteer that, which would be my practice. If I were pulled over, I would say immediately, I have a gun and my hands are on the steering wheel and are not moving until you tell me to do otherwise. So I think it depends on the situation. I think Professor Jonas is right. They do worry about going into homes. Now, some of these episodes involved high risk warrants being executed and so on. And so they're already, but I watched the video of the Locke case. And I could tell immediately, yes, he had his hand on a gun, but that gun was not pointed at a police officer. And a police officer should know you can't shoot at someone. I mean, that is established law in this circuit that that a person who has a gun, even if they have a gun in their hand, police cannot shoot that person unless they are doing something threatening with that gun. Like once they point at a police officer, well then, but if they just have a gun in their hand, it is unconstitutional. And police officers need to learn that.
Up front.
My question is along passions, but more straight away from police and guns. Do you think gun possession exacerbates violence? I'm thinking, I'm getting carjacked. I don't have a gun, but if I do, I pull it on them. They shoot back. I'd rather get my car up than shoot somebody. To be honest.
I agree with you. Yes, I do think guns exacerbate violence. You push a button and somebody dies or is gravely injured, right? I think it's a lot of the problem. People talk about mass incarceration with drugs. In Minnesota, we don't send a lot of people to prison for drugs. We send a lot of people to prison because they had guns, right? Either because they were not allowed to possess them because they were a felon or because they were involved in a violent criminal interaction. If we didn't have those guns, our prison population would be greatly reduced as well.
How would you prefer a gun over like other forms of self-defense weapons like pepper spray, tasers, even personal alarms, things like that?
Well, obviously I say yes, right? It's not, even if it's turned against you, you're not going to die, right? Even if it's turned against you, you're not going to die. Even if your children get it, they're not going to die. Even if someone is with a serious mental illness in your home, they're not going to mace themselves to death, right? So I say yes.
Some of it comes down to just how effective it is in stopping the aggression. Mace will have some effect, but most people probably just make them more angry that you have done this. It's not it's better than nothing. In terms of a taser, that's an unusual thing for people to carry around. So I'm not sure, and we know that tasers often don't. Even when police are using them in a justifiable way, the person doesn't really go down right away. Now, there is an interesting alternative that is beginning to get some attention, and that is firearms that fire a projectile at a lower speed. You know, it hurts, it hits you and it hurts, but it is not a full-fledged firearm. You don't even need to have a license for a gun in order to own this type of projectile shooting object. And getting hit with that several times would certainly make it somewhat more likely that the person might go down. So there are some alternatives.
Good. Over here.
Yes, full disclosure, I wasn't the top strategist. I was for a state violation, for example. And even though I worked in a suburb where I was able to get, responses of Danko violations and a quicker response time, some logistical issues just unfortunately happened. Would it then be almost a common good for a severely victimized segment of society, of domestic violence victims, owning firearms to prevent Danko violations or being re-victimized by their abusers?
I think most of the time in that situation, the abuser would end up turning the gun on the person. I think the emotions would be too, and on the police officers who come to respond, right? I mean, police officers are coming into these situations where the populace is armed, and it's in that heightened domestic violence situation. Greater minds, calm minds do not prevail.
I do think you have to come back to some of the cautionary statements that I made. I would not encourage someone who's worried about a partner who's no longer living in the home to get a gun and put it in their dresser drawer without knowing something more about it. One of the women that I know at the range that I met, she got a gun because of exactly that situation, that she had been abused by her partner and he was still stalking her, and she got a firearm, and she took it upon herself to learn how to use it and to be very familiar with how it worked, so that hopefully we wouldn't have those sorts of concerns about that. So yes, I think it's true of anyone. If you're going to have a gun, you really do need to know what you're doing, and if you're not willing to do that, then you really shouldn't have a gun.
Way in the yes, Maureen Burke.
I just, Professor Sisk, it seems like you're making rules for the A++ student. And, I get you that you are both that, both in terms of your safety precautions and also presumably your self-awareness. I like to say I'm way too hard to live with to have a gun in the house. And Tom says I'm not, but just in case. Anyway.
And he's not very violent, if I explain.
So I guess that's my concern. I mean, great. Yeah, great. This can have a gun. But what does that say for the rest of us?
Well, I think that's a fair point. And I come back to the requirements in Minnesota that you have to follow in order to be able to carry a gun. So there are some states that have moved to universal carry or constitutional carry. Maybe there's a Second Amendment argument for that, but I don't think it's the greatest policy. If I were in control of those rules, I would ratchet up the requirements for having a permit. I would require additional training. I would require regularly going to the range and becoming better at using that. But one of the things that about concealed carry permit owners is a very significant criminal background check, and that is done with respect to that. And so you may not be aware of this, but 387,000 Minnesotans have a carry permit. For adults, that's approaching 1 in 10 adults in Minnesota have a carry permit. And the violent crime rate of that group is incredibly tiny. They do commit crimes, but most of those crimes are things like hunting without a license, and the biggest share is traffic and drunk driving. Violent crimes committed by those who have passed the carry permit are incredibly small. They're like 0.02%. So I hear what you're saying. I would like to see a movement towards more requiring those sorts of trainings. And of course, in Minnesota, you do if you're carrying it. Now, you don't have to do it to have it in your own home. And I'm not sure that I want to go to the point of telling people you got to have a permit and go through the training just to have a gun in your own home. But I'm glad that we have the rules that we do for carrying. And I encourage those who are thinking about buying a gun to take the additional step of taking that training and getting the permit.
You, Porter?
I too grew up around guns, not because my family were hunters, but I have two parents who are Marines, My mother was a sharpshooter, hit you out of the yards and yards with a hip. My dad was a marksman, and so I grew up around them. I personally have a 90% accuracy with a handgun, and used to be able to break down and put together an M16 blindfold. Can't do that anymore. I have to keep. And, even if I too agree that people have a right to public safety or personal safety and whatever, my question is: everybody has a right to every kind of gun and every caliber of gun, because so many of these that people buy, they don't know how to use and are for weapons of mass destruction. And how many times, I don't know the statistic, is someone who says, I buy this in order to protect my home from home invasion, do they need to be able to shoot that many rounds at a time?
I don't want to go too far into that because it goes a little bit away from what the conversation was today. But I think you make a very important point. If you're thinking about buying a gun for self-defense and for home defense, I know there are those who make the argument as to how valuable an AR-15 can be in that kind of a situation. And I respect that argument. I've heard it made and I understand it. That's not what the choice that I have made for self-defense. And again, I think you need to know what it is that you're getting and how you're using it. In terms of the size of magazines, let me just say this about that. There is no magazine limit in Minnesota. There is no size limit in Minnesota. The typical 9mm handgun holds 15 rounds, 16 if you put one in the chamber. And there have been proposals to restrict it to 10. That doesn't get me too excited, but I still think it's a bad idea. And the reason why I think it's a bad idea is what the statistics show. Statistics show that it takes an average of 3 shots to put down a violent aggressor. Now, the majority will stop with 1 shot, but it takes an average of 3 hits on the body of an aggressor to stop them. Studies of trained police officers in engaging with criminals who are shooting at them, who don't just stand still like a target in the range and are moving around, 15% of shots actually struck the person. So you combine those two statistics together, and you need more than 10 rounds. If you don't need, I would be, if you don't want to ban a drum of 50 rounds, I'm with you. But I think 15 would be a limit that I think makes sense.
Good time for one more question. Yes.
Jonas?
In light of this philosophy, I didn't understand the argument in light of the Second Amendment, but also the Catholic Catechism on 263, which talks about the obligations of the others, and why we just didn't all that or not allowed. That doesn't get
Well, I guess I didn't argue either of those things. So I think you're challenging me in saying that under the Catholic tradition, we should be armed in order to protect others.
that why we take that medication from someone's guaranteed discussion that goes further. And further is that you have an obligation to defend those who can't. Like if I had children, or someone who's disabled.
Yeah. Well,
So I would say
I do ultimately believe that. I think we will all be safer, that we will all be defending our children better, our children writ large, if we don't have guns. And I completely disagree with the current interpretation of the Second Amendment. It talks about a well-armed militia, not a well-armed Professor Sisk. So that's where I will go.
so that would be the Second Amendment.
So on the Second Amendment, I would quote it a little bit differently. I'd say, in order that there be a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to carry arms shall not be infringed. So it's still referring. So I think there's a purpose stated, but it's the people who get to own that. I don't know that I would be in favor of banning all guns if I thought it would really work. I'm not sure that I would go there, but I'm confident it wouldn't work. Not in the United States today. There are at least 500 million firearms in the United States today. No one, well, some are, but almost no one is proposing banning all of those. I mean, even those who have been proposing banning the AR-15, for the most part, they say, but not those who currently have one. We're not going to try to go around and round up 44 million of those. So the guns are there. What I want to talk about is how do I defend myself and what changes can we make in culture, mental health, and education to reduce the abuse of firearms. Because I just don't think we're going to enter into a world anytime soon in which we're like Scotland, in which there are no guns anywhere.
Let's do one more hour on the Second Amendment.
All right.
Are we? Oh, we're out of time? All right.